Emo girls bully Malia Obama, thinking she's an easy target. But everything changes when her father, Barack Obama, shows up at the park. Subscribe to the channel and comment and where you're watching this video from. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the air as Malia Obama strolled down the winding paths of the small park. This was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the weight of her last name and feel like any other 20-something figuring out her path in life. The park was nestled in the heart of a sleepy little town far from Washington, D.C., far from the persistent eyes of the media. Here, she wasn't Malia Obama, the former first daughter. She was just Malia, a young woman with a love for literature and a craving for solitude. Her life in the public eye had been a whirlwind of appearances, cameras, and constant scrutiny. The Obamas had always emphasized humility and the importance of staying grounded, but even with their support, she had yearned for a taste of anonymity. After completing her studies, Malia chose this town as her temporary haven, a place where no one would recognize her or care about her family's legacy. The park quickly became her favorite retreat. It wasn't particularly large or grand, but its simple beauty charmed her. Gravel paths curved around clusters of old oak trees, their sprawling branches forming a natural canopy. A small pond reflected the sky, its surface occasionally disturbed by ducks paddling lazily. Benches were scattered strategically along the trails, offering quiet spots for reflection. One particular bench, positioned beneath a willow tree, had become hers. It was shaded, private, and had a clear view of the pond, a perfect place to read. She clutched a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice as she approached the bench. It was her ritual to lose herself in books during her walks here. The familiar characters and timeless prose were a welcome escape from reality. As she settled into her spot, the world around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of children playing, and the soothing rhythm of her own breath. But the park wasn't hers alone. As idyllic as it seemed, it was a microcosm of life. Retirees walked their dogs, young mothers pushed strollers along the paths, and teenagers lounged on the grass in tight-knit groups. Among these regulars was a particular cluster that often caught her attention, not for their charm, but for their distinct energy. The group of girls, teenagers dressed in dark clothing with heavy eyeliner and dyed hair, stood out like shadows against the sunlit park. Their style screamed rebellion, their laughter carried an edge, and their stares lingered just a moment too long. They often gathered in the same open patch of grass near the edge of the pond, where they sprawled out, talking animatedly and pointing at passers-by. At first, Malia found them intriguing. Their confidence was palpable, their voices unapologetically loud. They seemed so different from her own upbringing, where poise and discretion were valued above all. But as days turned into weeks, she noticed their behavior more closely. They had a habit of singling people out, whispering and giggling as they passed by. Sometimes their comments were loud enough to be overheard, deliberately targeting the insecurities of their chosen subject. Malia tried to avoid drawing their attention. She kept her head down as she walked past them, focusing on the well-trodden path or the book in her hands. She told herself they were just kids, harmless and full of bravado. Still, there was an underlying tension whenever she felt their gazes on her back. One afternoon, she felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She glanced up from her book and saw the group gathered on the grass, their eyes fixed on her. One of the girls, the apparent leader with jet black hair and a studded choker, leaned in to whisper something to the others. They erupted in laughter. Malia returned her attention to her book, her heart beating a little faster. She wasn't afraid of them. She had faced far scarier situations in her life. But there was something unsettling about their deliberate focus on her. It wasn't overt hostility, not yet. It was the kind of probing curiosity that made her wonder what they were planning. As the weeks went by, the group became a constant presence in the park. They didn't approach her, but their proximity was hard to ignore. They seemed to delight in being noticed, whether it was by shouting across the pond or loudly recounting exaggerated stories. Malia found herself glancing in their direction more often than she liked, half expecting them to call out to her. Despite their antics, she didn't let them deter her from her routine. The park was her haven, and she wasn't about to give it up because of a group of teenagers. She reminded herself that they were probably harmless, more interested in impressing each other than actually confronting her. She stayed on her bench, flipping pages and immersing herself in the fictional worlds she loved so much. But the feeling lingered. As she closed her book one afternoon and prepared to leave, she caught a glimpse of the girls again. This time, they weren't laughing. They were simply watching her, their expressions unreadable. Malia felt a shiver run down her spine. She brushed it off and walked away, telling herself it was nothing. Still, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that it might be something after all. The air was heavy with the warmth of late afternoon as Malia strolled through the familiar paths of the park. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the gravel trails. Despite the lingering sense of unease from her previous visits, she felt a strange pull to return to her usual bench beneath the willow tree. The park was her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe, even if it meant occasionally brushing up against the discomfort of others' curiosity. She had brought a new book with her today, To Kill a Mockingbird. The choice felt almost ironic given the events of recent weeks, but the story's themes of resilience and justice resonated with her. She clutched the book tightly as she approached her usual spot. It was empty, as it always seemed to be, and she allowed herself a small sigh of relief as she settled onto the bench. The first few pages absorbed her completely. The rhythmic cadence of the narrative, the vivid imagery of small-town life, and the complexity of its characters pulled her in. For a brief moment, she forgot the group of girls, forgot the prickling sensation of their stares. She was simply Malia, lost in a world of words. But the reprieve didn't last long. The sound of laughter broke through her concentration, loud and piercing against the otherwise tranquil backdrop of the park. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. The group of girls had arrived, their familiar presence a storm on the horizon of her peaceful afternoon. They were louder than usual today, their voices carried across the park, sharp and mocking. Malia kept her eyes fixed on the page, pretending not to notice, but she could feel their attention shifting toward her. The leader, the girl with the jet-black hair and choker, was the first to move. She stood up, brushing grass from her ripped jeans, and started walking toward Malia's bench. The others followed, their footsteps crunching against the gravel in unison. Malia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She kept her focus on her book, willing herself to remain calm. Maybe they'd just pass by. Maybe this was all in her head, but they didn't pass by. They stopped right in front of her bench. She could see their boots out of the corner of her eye. Scuffed leather, thick soles, a deliberate contrast to her simple sneakers. The leader leaned casually against the backrest of the bench, close enough that Malia could feel her presence looming behind her. There was a long pause, the kind that felt heavier with each passing second. Malia turned a page even though she hadn't read a single word on it. She hoped they'd grow bored and move on. But then one of them spoke. "Nice book," the leader said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Malia's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't look up. She had dealt with far worse than this. A lifetime of scrutiny had taught her how to maintain her composure. Still, the deliberate invasion of her space was unnerving. Another girl chimed in, her voice sharp and mocking. "What's next? Knitting in the park? You look like someone's grandma." The group burst into laughter, their voices ringing in the otherwise quiet park. Malia's grip on her book tightened, but she kept her gaze steady, fixed on the words in front of her. The leader wasn't satisfied with the lack of reaction. She stepped closer, leaning over Malia's shoulder to glance at the book in her hands. "To Kill a Mockingbird," she read aloud, her voice dripping with exaggerated curiosity. "Wow, you're really trying to impress someone, huh? Deep stuff." Malia's jaw tightened. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but she knew that would only feed their amusement. Instead, she turned the page, forcing herself to appear unfazed. The leader wasn't deterred. She plopped down on the other end of the bench, sprawling out as if she owned it. The others circled around, their presence closing in on Malia like a tightening noose. "You come here a lot, don't you?" one of the girls asked, her tone deceptively casual. "Always sitting here, always alone. What's the deal?" Malia finally looked up. Her eyes swept over the group, taking in their smirks and the challenge in their gazes. She met the leader's eyes last. There was something in them, an edge of curiosity beneath the hostility. It was as if she was daring Malia to react. "I like the quiet," Malia said, her voice calm but firm. It was the first time she had spoken to them, and the simple statement seemed to throw them off balance for a moment. The leader raised an eyebrow, then laughed. "The quiet? You mean the boring? No wonder you're always by yourself." The group laughed again, but there was a nervous edge to it now. Malia's composure was unexpected, and it unsettled them. One of the girls, emboldened by the laughter, reached out and grabbed the book from Malia's hands. "Let's see what's so great about this." Malia's breath caught. She rose to her feet, her voice steady but firm. "Give it back." The girl hesitated, her confidence wavering under Malia's unflinching gaze. But the leader snatched the book from her, flipping through its pages with exaggerated nonchalance. "Relax, we're just having a look. No need to get so serious." Malia stood her ground, her eyes locked on the leader. For a moment, the air between them felt electric, charged with an unspoken challenge. Then, with a smirk, the leader tossed the book back onto the bench. "There you go, bookworm," she said. "Don't get your feathers ruffled." The group laughed as they retreated, their voices fading as they walked away. Malia watched them go, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat back down on the bench, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the book. She stayed there for a long time after they left, staring at the pond and trying to steady her thoughts. The peace of the park felt fractured now, its sanctuary tainted by their presence. For the first time, Malia wondered if she'd made a mistake in coming here. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the park emptied out, she made a quiet decision. She wasn't going to let them drive her away. The next few days passed in an uneasy rhythm. Malia returned to the park as usual, determined not to let the encounter with the girls change her routine. Yet, the memory of their mocking voices lingered in her mind like the aftertaste of something bitter. Every time she approached her usual bench, she found herself scanning the area for their familiar silhouettes, her steps hesitating just slightly before she sat down. At first, it seemed as though they had moved on. The park felt quieter, more serene, and Malia allowed herself to relax. She opened her book and let the words carry her away, convincing herself that the girls had simply been bored and that she was no longer their focus. But the reprieve didn't last. On a crisp afternoon, as Malia turned the corner of the gravel path that led to her bench, she noticed something unusual. A piece of paper was taped to the backrest of her bench. From a distance, it looked innocuous, but as she drew closer, she saw the jagged handwriting and crude drawing that adorned it. The words "Lonely Princess" were scrawled across the top, with a stick figure wearing a crown sitting alone on a bench. Below it, a speech bubble read, "I'm too good for everyone." Her chest tightened, and she glanced around the park instinctively. The girls were nowhere in sight, but she knew immediately who was responsible. She tore the paper down, crumpled it in her hands, and shoved it into her bag. Her first instinct was to leave, to find another spot in the park, or simply go home, but she forced herself to sit down. This was her place, and she wasn't going to let them take it from her. The following days brought more of the same. Another note appeared, this one tucked under the armrest of her bench. Why so serious? Smile for once. Then came a small toy crown left on the seat, its meaning clear. Each time Malia discarded the items and tried to brush them off, but the girl's presence loomed larger in her mind. They didn't need to be physically there to make her feel watched, judged. Her discomfort turned to anger the day she spotted them across the park, huddled together and whispering. They weren't near her bench, but their occasional glances in her direction confirmed her suspicions. They were still watching her, still amused by their game. She wanted to confront them, to tell them to leave her alone, but she knew it would only feed their need for attention. Instead, she focused on her book, willing herself to appear indifferent, even as her hands trembled slightly. The tipping point came on a sunny Saturday. The park was busier than usual, filled with families, joggers, and dog walkers enjoying the clear skies. Malia arrived early, hoping to find a moment of peace before the crowds thickened. She settled onto her bench and opened her book, determined to lose herself in its pages. She didn't hear them approach. The first sign of their presence was a splash of cold liquid soaking through her jeans. She gasped, jumping up to see a large, wet stain spreading across her lap. A girl with streaks of purple in her hair stood in front of her, holding an empty water bottle with a smirk. "Oops," the girl said, her voice dripping with mock innocence. "Didn't see you there." The others stood a few steps behind her, stifling their laughter but failing miserably. The leader, as always, stood slightly apart, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with an air of detached amusement. Malia's initial shock gave way to a surge of anger. She clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to take a deep breath. She had dealt with public scrutiny, harsh criticism, and even threats during her time in the White House. She wasn't going to let a group of teenagers rattle her. "I'd say you owe me an apology," Malia said, her voice calm but firm. The girl with the water bottle blinked, clearly not expecting a direct response. For a moment, the bravado cracked, but the leader quickly stepped in, closing the distance between them. "Relax, Grandma," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "It's just water. Don't be so uptight." The group burst into laughter again, and Malia felt her jaw tighten. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze steady and unyielding. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Without another word, she grabbed her bag, turned on her heel, and walked away. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with the weight of the encounter. She felt humiliated, furious, and powerless all at once. The park had been her refuge, and now it felt tainted, a battleground instead of a sanctuary. When she got home that evening, she found herself pacing her small apartment, replaying the events in her mind. She hated that they had gotten to her, that they had made her feel so small. Her father's words echoed in her memory, advice he had given her countless times during their years in the spotlight. Don't let them see you sweat. The next morning, she sat down and wrote a letter to her parents. She didn't give them all the details, not wanting to worry them, but she expressed her frustration and the difficulty of staying composed in the face of persistent hostility. She needed their advice, their reassurance that she could handle this on her own. Malia mailed the letter, but deep down she knew that her parents would never ignore even the vaguest hint of trouble. She wasn't surprised when, a few days later, she received a call from one of her father's aides, casually checking in. It was his way of letting her know that they were aware of the situation, even if they wouldn't intervene directly. The girl's taunts continued, but something shifted in Malia's resolve. She didn't react outwardly anymore, didn't let their games rattle her. She refused to let them win, even if it meant enduring their presence in silence. But the storm brewing around her wasn't done yet. The girls weren't satisfied with her lack of response, and Malia could feel the tension building, a quiet promise of escalation she couldn't ignore. The sun filtered through the lace curtains in Malia's small apartment as she sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea. It had been a week since she'd sent the letter to her parents, and though she hadn't included much detail, she suspected they'd understand the weight behind her words. They always did. Her father, Barack Obama, had a way of intuiting when she needed him most. It was a skill he'd developed during his years as a president, a father, and a man accustomed to reading between the lines. So, when one of his aides casually mentioned that Malia had been in touch and seemed a little off, he wasted no time in deciding to intervene. It was a quiet Friday morning when he arrived in the sleepy little town. Barack had always been mindful of his presence in public spaces, understanding the disruption it could cause. He kept his visit low-key, arriving in an unmarked SUV with only one member of his security detail. The simplicity of his arrival suited the purpose of his visit. It wasn't about making a statement, but about being there for his daughter. He found her in the park, sitting on her usual bench beneath the willow tree. From a distance, she looked as composed as ever, her posture straight, her attention focused on the book in her lap. But he knew his daughter well enough to notice the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she occasionally glanced around as if expecting something, or someone. As he approached, she looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. He smiled, a warm and steadying presence, and she rose to meet him. "Dad," she said, her voice a mix of relief and uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged casually, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how my favorite daughter is doing." They sat together on the bench, the familiar rhythm of their conversation easing some of the tension in Malia's chest. She didn't ask how he'd found out about the situation. She knew better than to think her parents wouldn't notice even the smallest hint of trouble. And though she didn't share every detail, the mere act of sitting beside him made her feel a little less alone. As they talked, a subtle shift occurred in the park's usual dynamics. The group of girls had arrived, their laughter and chatter cutting through the quiet. They hadn't yet noticed Malia or her father, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Barack followed Malia's gaze, his expression thoughtful as he observed the group from a distance. He didn't ask any questions, but she knew he'd put the pieces together. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet acknowledgment of the challenges she faced. After a while, he rose from the bench, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "Wait here," he said gently. Malia's heart quickened as she watched him walk toward the girls. She wanted to stop him, to tell him it wasn't necessary, but a part of her knew that her father wasn't the type to stand idly by when someone he loved was hurting. The girls noticed him as he approached, their laughter fading into a tense silence. He didn't have to introduce himself. His face was unmistakable, even to those who weren't politically inclined. Their postures stiffened, and the leader, the girl with jet black hair and the studded choker, stood up trying to mask her unease with a facade of confidence. Barack addressed them calmly, his tone measured and devoid of anger. He spoke about the importance of kindness, about the responsibility they all shared in creating a world where everyone felt safe and respected. He didn't single anyone out, didn't raise his voice or point fingers. Instead, he offered them something far more impactful: perspective. "You never really know what someone is carrying," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "And it doesn't cost anything to choose kindness." The girls shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his words. For a moment, they looked like the teenagers they were, uncertain, vulnerable, and perhaps a little ashamed. When he finished speaking, he turned and walked back to Malia, leaving the girls in stunned silence. He sat beside her again, the familiar warmth of his presence grounding her. "Thanks, Dad," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of gratitude and emotion. He smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Any time." As they left the park together, the tension that had lingered around Malia for weeks seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet strength. Her father's visit was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that she had a support system ready to stand by her in the face of adversity. And though she didn't look back, she couldn't help but wonder what the girls were thinking now. Their game disrupted by the steady resolve of a man who had faced far greater challenges than they could ever imagine. The days following Barack Obama's visit to the park carried a peculiar stillness, as though the air itself had shifted. Malia felt lighter, as though a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. Her father's presence had been a powerful reminder of her resilience and the support system she had behind her. Still, she wondered if his calm but firm words had truly made an impression on the group of girls, or if their taunts would persist in subtler ways. For the first time in weeks, she returned to the park without hesitation. The willow tree awaited her, its long branches swaying gently in the breeze. The bench was unoccupied, free of notes or trinkets left by the girls. She sat down, her book in hand, and allowed herself to breathe deeply, soaking in the tranquility of the moment. The peace, however, was not destined to last. She became aware of a figure approaching hesitantly from across the park. Glancing up, she saw one of the girls from the group, the one with streaks of purple in her hair, walking toward her. The girl's usual confident stride was replaced by an awkward shuffle, her hands jammed into the pockets of her jacket. She looked around nervously, as if checking to see who might be watching. Malia straightened, setting her book down on the bench beside her. Her heartbeat quickened as she watched the girl approach, unsure what to expect. Was this another attempt to provoke her, or was something else at play? The girl stopped a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Malia didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the girl's posture. Gone was the arrogance, the mocking tone that had defined their earlier encounters. She seemed small, vulnerable. I just wanted to, talk, the girl continued, stumbling over her words. She glanced up briefly, her eyes filled with a mixture of hesitation and guilt. I mean, about the stuff we did. You know, the notes and everything. Malia raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for the girl to continue. The girl sighed, pulling her hands out of her pockets and wringing them nervously. Look, I know we were jerks, and not just a little, like a lot. We thought it was funny at the time, but after what your dad said, she trailed off, her voice faltering. I guess I didn't really think about how it felt for you, or what it said about us. Malia leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. She hadn't expected an apology, much less one delivered with such apparent sincerity. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her tone calm but firm. The girl hesitated again, biting her lip. Because it's been eating at me, she admitted. When he said those things about kindness and not knowing what someone's going through, it hit me hard. And when I found out who you are, who your dad is, it made me feel even worse. Malia's expression softened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. She wanted to hear everything. I guess we just didn't think of you as a real person, the girl continued, her voice trembling slightly. You were just someone to mess with. But seeing him and the way he talked to us like we mattered, even after how we treated you, it made me realize how wrong we were. I'm sorry. For all of it. The words hung in the air between them, raw and unpolished. For a moment, Malia didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to accept the apology and move on, but another part of her felt the weight of everything she had endured. Forgiveness wasn't something she could give lightly, not when the wounds were still fresh. Why are you here alone? Malia asked instead, her tone thoughtful. Where are the others? The girl shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward the area where the group usually gathered. They don't know I'm here, she admitted. They don't get it. Not yet, anyway. I needed to do this for myself. Malia studied her for a moment longer, then let out a quiet sigh. Thank you, she said finally, for saying that. It takes courage to admit you were wrong. The girl's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she offered a tentative smile. So, we're good? Malia tilted her head, considering her response carefully. We're on the way to being good, she said, but trust is earned, not given. If you're serious about making things right, you'll have to show it. Not just to me, but to others too. The girl nodded, her expression earnest. I will, she promised. I mean it. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps lighter than when she had arrived. Malia watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling within her. She wanted to believe the apology was genuine, that the girl's words marked the beginning of a change. But she also knew that actions would speak louder than any apology. As the afternoon wore on, Malia found herself reflecting on the conversation. It was a small step, but it felt significant. Maybe her father's words had planted a seed, not just in the girl who had approached her, but in the entire group. Time would tell whether that seed would grow. For now, though, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about the possibility of change, the chance to turn something painful into something meaningful. And as she picked up her book and began to read again, she allowed herself to feel the first stirrings of peace. The park was unusually quiet that morning. The light drizzle that had started at dawn had left the grass damp and the paths slick with water. Malia sat on her familiar bench beneath the willow tree, the sheltering branches offering some respite from the lingering droplets. She had come early today, hoping for a moment of solitude before the usual crowd of joggers, dog walkers, and families began to filter in. Her book lay open in her lap, but her attention kept drifting. The apology from the girl with the purple-streaked hair replayed in her mind. It had been unexpected, raw, and oddly genuine. Despite her guarded response, Malia couldn't help but feel that it had been a step toward something better. And yet, the other girls hadn't appeared since that day, leaving her unsure of what to expect. As she turned the page, a movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. She glanced up to see another figure approaching. This time it was the leader of the group, the girl with jet black hair and the studded choker. Her usual swagger was noticeably absent. She walked slowly, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her oversized jacket, her eyes downcast. Malia's first instinct was to tense, but something about the girl's posture stopped her. She didn't look threatening or mocking. She looked uncertain, vulnerable even. The girl paused a few feet away from the bench, hesitating as if unsure whether to continue. Malia closed her book, placing it gently beside her, and met the girl's gaze. "Mind if I sit?" the girl asked, her voice quieter than Malia had ever heard it. Malia gestured to the empty space on the bench, and the girl sat down, keeping a noticeable distance between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the distant chirping of birds. "I'm not good at this," the girl said finally, breaking the silence. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her jacket. "Talking to people like this, but I figured I should try." Malia waited, giving her the space to continue. The girl took a deep breath as if steeling herself. "What we did, it was wrong. I know that now. I think I always knew, but I didn't care enough to stop. I thought it was funny, or cool, or whatever. But after what your dad said, it made me realize how messed up it was." Malia's expression remained neutral, though her heart softened slightly at the girl's words. She had expected excuses or defensiveness, but there was none of that here. Only an awkward, unpolished attempt at accountability. "I don't know what it's like to be you," the girl continued, her voice steadying, "but I get now that I never tried to understand. I just saw you as this easy target, and I'm sorry for everything." There it was, laid bare, no sarcasm, no deflection, just an apology. Malia considered her response carefully, wanting to balance honesty with grace. "I appreciate you saying that," she said finally. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong." The girl nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what he said, about how you don't know what someone's carrying, and it hit me. Maybe we've all got stuff we're carrying, you know? I was just too focused on my own to notice anyone else's." Malia tilted her head, studying the girl's face. There was a rawness there, a hint of the pain that likely fueled her earlier behavior. It didn't excuse what had happened, but it made it easier to understand. "You're right," Malia said. "We all have things we carry, but it doesn't mean we have to hurt others to deal with them." The girl nodded again, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out. It's not easy." Malia smiled faintly. "It rarely is, but trying is a good start." The girl glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. For a moment, the tension between them dissolved, replaced by an unspoken understanding. They were two people from vastly different worlds, but in this moment, they met as equals. The girl rose from the bench, brushing her hands against her jeans. "I don't know if we'll ever be friends or anything, but I just wanted to make things right. Or at least start to." Malia nodded. Starting is enough. The girl gave a small, almost shy smile before walking away, her steps more confident than when she had arrived. Malia watched her go, a quiet sense of closure settling over her. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward, and that was enough. As the day wore on, Malia found herself reflecting on the entire experience. The taunts, the apology, her father's steadying presence, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. Life was messy, complicated, and often unfair, but it also held the potential for growth and change. Later that evening, Malia sat at her desk, pen in hand. She wrote a letter to her father, her words spilling onto the page with ease. Dear Dad, thank you for being there when I needed you most. Your words didn't just reach me, they reached them too. You always told me that kindness could be powerful, but I never truly understood how much until now. You were right, as always. The world is full of good people. Sometimes they just need a little reminder to act like it. She paused, tapping the pen against her chin before adding one last line. And sometimes, so do I. As she folded the letter and prepared it for the mail, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The events in the park had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but they had also reminded her of her own strength. The journey wasn't over, but for now she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing she had done her part to make the world a little kinder. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories and updates. Check out our other videos and share this one with friends who might enjoy it. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you for watching.